Thank you very much for singing that so well, and thank you, Sarah, for picking that. My brother and sister-in-law live in Brantford, and last summer we were visiting them, and we had a little family trip to the Alexander Graham Bell homestead. Bell was, of course, the inventor of the telephone. And I'm amazed to say that even though I lived in that part of Ontario for many years, I had never before been to the Bell homestead. And so we went last summer for a couple of hours and had a tour of the house. And it really is a well-done little museum. And you get a guided tour from a young student who's been very well informed about Bell and the history of the period and so on. And so if you happen to be in the Brantford area sometime this summer or in the future, I recommend heartily taking a little trip to the Bell homestead. One of the things that I noticed especially about the tour of the house where Bell and his family lived when they came to Canada from Scotland was not stuff related to the telephone, but some of the things related to the way they lived in their time. And one thing in particular really stands out in my memory, and that is that the curtains in the house are dragging on the floor. The fabric is at least a foot or so too long, and so it's all crumpled at the baseboards. And the young student who was giving us the tour of the house was saying that in that time, that was a small way that folks would show off their wealth or their opulence. You see, they wanted to show their friends and family and neighbors that they could afford the extra foot or so of fabric to have these curtains that were too long. And it looks silly, and yet in those days, it was the height of fashion. It was one of the ways that they would show off. I think it's one of the interesting things about human society that in different times and in different places we have this common desire to show off, particularly our wealth if we have it, and even if we're not particularly wealthy, we like to engage in these small acts of lifestyle that make it appear as though we are wealthy. Economists call this a conspicuous consumption. We call it showing off, and we could think of lots of examples of the ways that we like to show off wealth. One of the ones that always sticks in my mind as well is that in generations past, having pale skin was very much in fashion. Having tan skin was out of fashion. It was because the wealthy stayed inside and the poorer working classes had to work outside, and those poorer folks who had to work outside long hours got tan skin, and so pale skin became associated with wealth or the need to not work outside, and so pale skin was in fashion. Nowadays, tan skin is in fashion because tan skin is associated with leisure time, the ability and the opportunity to not be working inside, but be enjoying leisure time outside. And we could be here all afternoon talking about different examples of the ways we like to show off as humans. As Christians, what are we showing off? It's very popular among Christians today to want to show off success, to show off wealth, to show off happiness, to show off good health, to show off successful careers. to show off happy and successful families. Indeed, there is some goodness and truth in this desire. After all, the God who made us and the God who loves us and the God who is active in our world and in our lives sometimes gives us good gifts. Sometimes God's grace is at work in our lives in very practical and visible ways. And it is good and right that we be thankful to God for the good gifts we have received in life and to be able to express that thankfulness in ways that others around us can see how good God is and that God is active in our lives and in our world. Sometimes God gives us good things we do not deserve. Sometimes, conversely, following Jesus and living faithful Christian lives can help us to live lives which are more prosperous materially and which are indeed healthier and happier. I think of one of the stories of John Wesley, who was a Church of England minister in the late 1700s who founded the Methodist movement from which this very church sprung. In Wesley's day, the Church of England was focused especially on ministering to the wealthy and to the upper classes in England. The vast majority of people, the poor and the working class of the day, were not being ministered to by the church. The church was not interested in them. The church was not reaching out to them by and large. Wesley changed this. He focused on ministering beyond the walls of the church. He and others led a movement of outreach to the coal miners and the factory workers and the poor and working classes who made up the bulk of the population in England at the time. One of the things that was observed among this movement of Methodism, which exploded like wildfire in England and spread to North America with great fervor, was that many of those folks who became more active in their Christian faith through the Methodist movement quit drinking and quit gambling and quit smoking and started going to bed earlier and loving their families more and as a result began to lead more prosperous, healthy, and happy lives. Interestingly, one of the things that Wesley observed was that as folks had become more active in their Christian faith and life and began to lead healthier and more prosperous lives, their hunger and desire for relationship with God did not disappear but began to wane slightly. And so indeed, sometimes success as we define it can come and follow from the Christian life. What we ought not to do, however, is to tie a sense of success as we might define it or want it to faith in some kind of cause and effect way. You see, it is not necessarily so that these kinds of life features follow from faith. And indeed, we ought not to look at folks and see how they're doing outwardly to our eyes and think that we can know something about their faith from these superficial signs. I think, for instance, of the example of Marva Dawn, who is an American Lutheran writer and one of the great saints of our day. She has led perhaps the most difficult life that I've ever heard of. For her entire adult life, virtually, since she was a young woman, she has experienced one serious, life-threatening illness after another. People look at Marva Dawn and often remark that she looks 40 or 50 years older than she actually is. She has had severe cancer on a number of occasions, a very severe diabetes, and she has had all kinds of other experiences of ill health, from broken bones and physical fragility to blindness and immobility, stemming not only from those serious conditions which she has, but also from the very harsh treatments which her body has endured. She has a wonderful, loving husband, but they have very little money, and they have no children. And she has led a very difficult life, and yet is a person full of faith and insight and inward joy. We think of the example of Jesus himself, to whom we have given our lives in service. He lived a very difficult life on earth, one not marked by many of the trappings of success. The gospel stories tell us that at times in his life, Jesus was homeless. He had nowhere to lay his head. Many times out in the wilderness, he and his disciples were hungry. Jesus was sometimes alone, without friends or family. Jesus suffered great persecution in his life. He experienced physical violence, wrongful arrest and conviction, even death as a capital punishment, unearned and undeserved. And so Jesus did not enjoy success as we often seek it. The relationship of our faith to the outward experiences of our lives is not a new one for us to wrestle with in our day. We learn as we read through the New Testament that the early Christians wondered about the same sorts of questions and wrestled with the same sorts of struggles. Daryl read just a few minutes ago for us a few lines from Paul's second letter to the church in Corinth. And behind the scenes and between the lines, we read that Paul and the Corinthian Christians were wondering about the hardships of their lives. They were wondering about their physical suffering, about their illnesses, about their emotional challenges, about their conflicts within the church, with their family members, and with their neighbors, and with society at large. They experienced that life was difficult, exceedingly so. Life sometimes brought on more than they could bear. And they wondered, where is God in all of this? How is God at work? And Paul offered some thoughts of hope and encouragement to the Corinthians. He said, to my understanding and interpretation, we suffer in this life, and we will die, that we might experience what Jesus himself experienced. But even more and even better than this, we suffer and die as Jesus did, so that we might rise with him. What is it that we as followers of Jesus are called by God to show off to the world. I suggest that what we are called to show off is not success as we or others might define it, but rather our likeness to Jesus. And we can show off our likeness to Jesus by being thankful for God's good gifts and by enjoying them as they come, to cherish God's blessings in our lives. At other times, however, we are showing off our likeness to Jesus by being faithful and hopeful in the midst of adversity. And when we are faithful and hopeful in the midst of adversity, especially, the world, those around us, can see Jesus in us. And as they see us being faithful and hopeful in adversity, they will begin to see God at work in our lives in new and amazing ways. What they will see, in fact, is that God gives and has given new life, both now and for eternity. Amen.